high performance training. 3, recovery by Coach Shannon. Content-sensitive slide, sure, kind of spelled out for you right there. We're going to try to describe all of these different concepts and indicate why recovery is needed for high performance training. What is recovery? Next couple slides I'm going to give you a what is sort of scenario with definitions right below them. First slide indicates recovery is restoration and recuperation to return what is lost, decompression, fatigue reduction, prevention of overtraining. And the gist of this slide is if we can understand what recovery is, we can apply techniques, methods, and modalities to increase recovery, which of course is going to increase high performance training. Next slide, what is recovery? This is from a different author. You can kind of look at the bottom of each one of the slides I'm going to show you here, and it'll give you the author and or the person that created the slide. Again, all of these slides are from the United States Olympic Committee Training Design Symposiums that were in 2007 and 2008, and because I was a national team coach for USA Wrestling, I was able to get all of this information and bring these slides to you. And all of the high performance slides, for the most part, this is where this information is coming from. You can kind of look through all of these informations here again, and essentially what it is describing is how you can determine what recovery is and what you need to do to actually get there. And we're going to show you several other slides here that indicate if we understand these concepts on these last two slides, we're easily able to apply recovery strategies to increase high performance training. Manipulate them, volume and load. Okay, there is a lot of information on this slide, but at this point you've probably seen high performance 2 and 3, and the first one of course. And if you understand just basic periodization model, which is on the left there, you see one microcycle building into the next microcycle, which builds into the third microcycle. In the fourth microcycle, there is a decrease in training. So if you look at the colors, they're indicating as they go up, green, yellow, and red. Each week is actually an increase in training load. Training load is volume times intensity. And then the fourth week, the training load actually goes down. So that would be manipulating the volume load in order to increase high performance training. If you take a look at the other information there on the right, you'll notice how if you go to the third and the fourth columns, those volume loads are being manipulated as well. 70%, 75%, 80%, 85%. And if you look at in the fourth column there, it shows the repetitions and kilograms actually being lifted. There again, you can see that the volumes are changing. If you were to go, basically a fifth week or so, then it would look similar to that next slide there where the volume load is actually being reduced. But these are all indicators of how you would be able to determine what you've done from one week to the next if you've planned accordingly. He's showing you there medium volume load, medium heavy volume load, and then very heavy volume load. Then of course you would be manipulating those like the fashion on the left to increase high performance training. Transition period. Now I throw this slide in there to indicate that there needs to be a transition period for high performance training, and on the other hand, transition period does not necessarily mean we're doing absolutely nothing. So the training amount is 40-50% of the max amount of training. So in other words, you're not going to absolutely do nothing when the season is technically over. There are still going to be things going on like maybe minor tournaments, but no major tournaments like a World Championships or Continental Championships. That's what that no serious competitions means. And this typically will happen in the off season, which should, if we're looking for high performance training, should last about 4 to 6 weeks. This is typically also when athletes will get health checks if necessary, meaning if they've got some type of major injury. Typically you won't have surgeries during the middle of the training season. If you're leading into your state championships, national championships, world championships, you'll kind of defer those to the end of the season. This is when this generally does happen, and all of the other planning actually occurs in that period too. This is where the coach actually has an end of the season meeting with the athlete, and then over the next 4 to 5, 6 weeks they plan accordingly based on what they've seen before. Again, the whole reason for the transition period is to build in recovery to the athlete's high performance training plan. Some things that can help coaches plan well. You can read this slide on your own time, but if you just focus on the green areas that are in bold, this is the essence of this slide. Knowing the volume training to competition ratio, knowing the number of competition phases in the year, knowing the sensible number of competition phases for the individual, knowing how to plan varying quality of competition. Now, if we are understanding all of these things and we're paying attention to the volume of training and what type of competitions we're going to be in that year, then we can, if you go back to the other side, we can kind of manipulate the training the same way that we manipulate the competitions, or vice versa. We can manipulate the competitions in order to increase high performance training. Again, if there is too much training going on, very difficult to recover. If there are too many competitions going on, very difficult to recover. In one of these other slides, we're going to show you an example of too many high level competitions. So knowing the sensible number of competition phases for the individual, that becomes increasingly important. And then the varying quality of the competition. In other words, there probably shouldn't be 10 to 12 world championship type of competitions in one year, because that's too many times for the athlete to peak. It's not, there isn't enough time. You need time in between each competition actually to peak. So if you've got 10 or 12 world championship type of competitions, that means it would be one per month, i.e. you probably never even had a transition period to begin with, and in order to peak that many times, you probably need 2 years, and we only have 12 months in a year, so you can follow that analogy there. Training recovery plans. This is another indication of the last slide there, where we're actually going to take a look at the season and plan not just the volume and intensity, but we're also going to plan in the recovery. So if you take a look at probably fourth from the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, midday recovery, and this is designed for training twice per day. I know a lot of our athletes, they'll train in the morning, either they'll do some type of drilling or they'll do some type of strength and conditioning, and then in the afternoon they'll have their main practice. May not necessarily be feasible during the high school season, but it could be. You can get really creative with how you're actually doing this. And then for an instance or an example, midday recovery, maybe that's just the stretching portion, a much longer stretch than you would have than you would during your other practices. Now, when we're in the summer with the athletes, and this becomes increasingly important. Now when we're doing 2-a-days, or if they're doing 2-a-days on their own, they throw in that midday recovery. If you go from left to right, you can see there are all different types of things that they're doing. Midday recovery, 30-minute, 90-minute nap. Cold plunge, 30 to 60 minutes. 30, 90-minute nap. So they're varying the amount and the times that they're actually doing the modalities or the methodology, because other research has shown that if you do the same thing all the time, you don't have a really good response. But if you change things up and you vary the response, the body is consistently having to adapt to that. If you go to the last or the second to last column, it says PM recovery. So again, they're tying in 2 types of recovery per day. And you can go from left to right again, and you can see how each one is varied, meaning they're not the same thing all the time. Now, of course, if this is done, it says weekly. If this is done over the course of each week throughout the course of the season, now you combine that with the course of an athletic career, you have much better performances, i.e. the athlete is rested and recovered and ready to go for just about every single competition. Again, we're trying to explain how and why recovery can enhance high-performance training. This next slide is from Selye. You can Google his name and you'll probably get this information. General adaptation syndrome, which is akin to what we're trying to do with the periodization plan, and we're calling it training adaptation syndrome. Take a look at the top there. The first column going from left to right, they all actually mean the same thing. They're just in different terms. But on other slideshows, we indicated how when you're training, before you're training, you're at homeostasis, and then when you start to train, you actually increase the amount of fatigue in the body just because of the volume, and you haven't actually done that. If we allow the body a chance to recover and rest overnight, instead of having 9 or 10, of the same type of practice over and over and over again and waiting to the weekend, which is actually too long, you actually give the athlete training or recovery modalities like a warm-up that helps the body get ready for the training, then a cool down and a warm down right after the training. And of course, if the athlete is eating and getting enough sleep, that is when those 2 lines go above homeostasis, and then the athlete has some type of super compensation, and then that cycle continues throughout the week and or throughout the year. If you follow from left to right, it says fatigue, recover, super compensation, and then involution, which means they actually start to go back down. Maybe you've had a competition, then the athlete is fatigued, and then they're going right back down to homeostasis, and then this is where training would actually begin again over the course of a year if you're doing it correctly. Where the overtraining portion actually comes in is maybe the athlete isn't getting enough sleep. Maybe the athlete is cutting too much weight and they're not paying attention to their nutritional needs. Or maybe the coach is planning too many high-intensity type of trainings with no actual recovery built in. And that's if we just stayed in that fatigue recover area and then we never actually did recover, meaning all of those things I just mentioned, like sleep, like rest, like stretching, like too many intense practices in a row, then this is where you go to the end. It says overtraining. Now, earlier I mentioned this slide is one and the same. It's just different descriptions on how to describe where an athlete would be becoming overtrained. If you just look at the furthest right column, overtraining, exhaustion, overtraining, temporary loss of athletic form, those are all different ways to say the same thing. If you read from left to right, they're basically all the same. What I want you guys to focus on is the third column where it says overreaching, typically what we do every single day in training. Supercompensation, what actually does occur if we've done what we needed to do and explain what the athlete needs to do. Overtraining, hopefully we never actually get to this stage, in as much as if we're following the recovery techniques as presented in this slide and some of the other slideshows that we've shown, we will have high performance training and never actually dip into that overtraining area. Recognizing the symptoms and strategies for coaches. Now, here is a super duper key for high performance training. Know the symptoms of overtraining. Obviously, once we understand what overtraining is, there are a lot of things we can do to actually thwart it from being in our training, high performance training plans. Increase the athlete's level of awareness. So the whole idea here is that we're explaining not only the technical physical skills of single leg, double leg, high crotch, gut wrench, ankle lace, switch, sit out, but we're also explaining to the athlete how to recover on a daily basis over the course of their career. Model and teach evaluate recovery basically is just the same thing I just said. Keep training fun and sport in perspective. Now, on some other slides, I sort of suggested the variation, and we'll see some other slides here that are going to build in variation. If you build in variation, that actually keeps the athletes and the training a little bit more fun versus doing the same thing every single day. If the training is varied, that actually is fun and or stimulating. Now, there are a bunch of different ways you can actually get creative with that. There are going to be some other slides here that sort of suggest that. And I think it's important, too, for coaches to communicate this to athletes. Sport is a part of life. It is not the only part of life. I think a lot of times when athletes feel like sport is the only part of their life, they put such a heavy emphasis on winning that sport is a little bit out of perspective. And now sometimes it's even hard for the athletes to train because they're so focused on not losing versus going out there and having fun and doing their very best that sometimes they freeze up. It's our job to explain to the athletes sport is a part of life. It's not the only part of life. These are some statements here that a German gymnast sort of suggested to his coaches after he had completed that schedule for 1996. Suddenly I couldn't do anymore. I just wanted the rest. Now this is what happens when we have, I mentioned earlier, if we have a lot of high-level type of competitions back to back to back to back. Now if you look from left to right there, it goes March, April, May, June. So those are high-level peaks within a short amount of time each month. And typically, you don't necessarily want those, that first one, 2 international competitions. Now, that could mean anything. Hopefully they weren't high-level competitions, but because they're listed on there, it sort of suggests to me that if perhaps those had been taken off, or maybe they had been, in February, now you give the athletes 6 or 7 weeks to peak for that World Championships. In this schedule, though, the World Championships were right before the European Championships, which was the Olympic selection trials. So in this indication here, the athlete was, you follow this model here. Typically, it's you're traveling to and from competition, so that's maybe 10 to 12 to 48 hours, depending on what part of the world it is. If it's a world championship, unless that other championship is in the same state, the traveling actually does increase fatigue. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. But March, April, May, and June, typically after a large competition, you'll take 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 days off just to regroup. In this sort of model here, that may not necessarily be possible. It may be impossible to take a week off from April, May to June because you're constantly trying to peak for every one of those competitions. So in this isn't, I didn't make this up. This is what the athlete actually said after competing this schedule because it was just too much. He just didn't want to do it anymore. All he wanted to do was rest. So we need to be proactive in preparing and planning for our athletes so that the recovery is built in. There is no recovery built into this training schedule, and that's something that I want all of us to be aware of as we're preparing our high-performance training. What is ICC number one and why ICC? I introduced this to my United States Olympic Education Center team as a part of the national team coaching staff for USA Wrestling. ICC simply stands for Individual Coaching Conversations, and the idea behind that is if we are communicating with our athletes, and I did this once a month, not only in practice, I didn't really call it ICC in practice, because basically in practice you're teaching and motivating and doing all those different things. Outside of practice, so that is where things actually become critical. So I designed ways that I could meet with the athlete once per month to do all of those things that are described there in that slide. If this is done on an ongoing basis, now you can tell if the athlete is under-recovered, overtrained, excited about training, upset about training, whatever's going on, along with all of those other ideas presented before this slide. This will actually help the athlete recover because much of stress is in the mind. Certainly it could be physically too, but much of stress is in the mind. A lot of times, if athletes can trust you and open up, that'll relieve some of the stress that's going on, which will ultimately help them perform at a high level. Next several slides are going to be examples of how and why, or what we could actually do to recover. In the Colorado Springs Olympic Training Center, they actually have a recovery center, and based on all of this information in this slide and some of the staff that works at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, they decided that it was a good idea to actually have a recovery center. My own personal experience, as I traveled with USA Wrestling all across the world, it was amazing to me that these recovery centers existed everywhere except in the USA. I think they built the recovery center as I was leaving. I was a resident athlete in Colorado Springs from 1997 to 99. I think in 2001 they actually started building. I think they were done in 2003, 2004. Around that time period. Nonetheless, these guys discovered out there, as I did when I traveled across the world, that most other training centers have recovery centers built right in there. Built right in as a part of, like if you have a weight room and you have an athletic training room, you also have a recovery center. So that's something that is new in the USA, not necessarily new for the rest of the world. Integrating recovery. This slide here shows different types of recovery. If they're done on a consistent basis, again, you need to vary just about everything that you're doing so that the body doesn't necessarily have a chance to get super duper used to it. So the body actually can adapt to things pretty quickly. So if we do the same thing all the time, it does not have the same effect. So if you're varying the recovery techniques and integrating them with an ice bath, and then sometimes it's a pool session, and then sometimes there's no structure at all. You just let them go out there. Again, a psychological portion of recovery is huge. If the athlete feels ready to go, 9 times out of 10 they are. Of course, we need to have the physical type of recovery too, and that's what those other ones are indicating. Massage can also be a part of it. Again, those are 3 or 4 different strategies right there. If done on a consistent basis, high performance training is closer. Psychological dimension, I've been sort of alluding to this all through this slideshow, but these are different ways and means that an athlete actually could not necessarily physically relax and or recover and or add in these things to reduce stress, but they're also books that they could be reading to teach them how to do that, and or we could read the books and we could teach them how to do it. As below suggests, meditation, yoga, autogenic training, that's simply self-talking the body down. I feel good, I'm relaxed, I'm going to take some deep breaths. Relaxation training and imagery training, all those last 3 there, those are heavily dealing with the mind, and it's, I think, our job and the athlete's job to research and discover how to do these things in order to increase high performance training. Again, this whole slideshow is on recovery, and these are psychological ways that the athletes can recover. Other methods of alternative objectives, conditioning. So what's the point of this slide? On one of those other slides, it sort of suggested that you could have structured type of workouts in the pool that would add recovery into the workout, and this is one of the examples. Or on the other hand, you can have non-structured where the athlete's just doing whatever they want to do. You need to have both of them likely. Instead of running sprints for instance, you could do a same type of workout in the pool, right? How is that going to be effective, and how is that going to work? Well, for one, if you're not doing weight-bearing things that are putting a lot of stress on the body, like you're in a pool, that immediately changes the way that the body's going to respond. And it's something that you're probably not even doing. Although when I was at the Olympic Training Center, Kevin Jackson, who was an Olympic champion, he built this right into our training. I mean, we went to the pool like every Monday. Sometimes it was ridiculous, and he would make it, like we were the Olympic swim team. And other times it was, there was no structure at all. We could just kind of play around. Again, what that does is it gives the body and the muscles a different way to actually train, and it's stimulating, and it actually can add a recovery component in it if done on a consistent basis and varied, so it's not the same thing all the time. How, the final step. All through this slideshow I've been alluding to and kind of, tap dancing around periodization. That is the key. Not only is periodization a form of, planning, training in steps in different periods, but it's also building in the recovery portion of the training. The recovery portion of the training needs to be planned just like everything else. The same way that you're planning the volume and intensities, you also have to plan in recovery. Now, the last phrase there, undulation, means instead of actually building, you're actually reducing the amount of training that's actually going on. So if you're climbing a hill, that would be basically climbing. When you undulate, you sort of go down the hill. So if you start at 10, it would be 9, maybe 7, maybe 5. So the undulation portion of it, which is going to, again, build in the recovery right into your periodization plan. Once we understand what periodization is and how we can do it, now we can plan the recovery phases of training along with the high intensity and the high volume training. If we have done everything that was suggested and alluded to on this slideshow, then we will have statements like this from many of our athletes. Better this year because I train less. Less tennis, more regeneration, and enforced breaks. And I guess that's the key. I just kind of read the blue bolded area there, and this suggests that the athlete, because they were doing and applying the modalities and methodologies of recovery, they actually were able to have better training and or better competitions because of the enforced break, because they actually felt better. So this is something that, again, I'm not making this up. This is coming from athletes, and we have to understand the psychology behind periodization and what we need to do physically so that we can build in the recovery to the athletes so they can have high performance training and or competitions. High performance training 3 recovery acknowledgments. I suggested earlier all of the information from this slide was derived from the United States Olympic Committee Training Design Symposiums. Thank you.